He thought she was just another lost old woman. But in less than 10 minutes, she would own every ounce of silence in that room. The Grand Astoria ballroom shimmered under layers of crystal chandeliers, casting golden reflections across polished marble floors that echoed with the soft click of designer heels and the low hum of curated laughter. It was the kind of night where influence wasn't just present, it was performed. Men in tailored tuxedos discussed investments in quiet corners, while women draped in silk and diamonds floated from group to group. Each conversation a subtle competition of status, wealth, and belonging. And then the doors opened. Margaret Whitmore stepped inside as if she had simply taken a wrong turn. Her coat was modest, a soft beige wool that had seen more winters than anyone in that room would care to admit. Her shoes were practical, low-heeled, the kind chosen for comfort rather than impression. She carried no clutch, no jewelry that sparkled under the lights, no visible sign that she belonged in a room where a single necklace could cost more than a house in the suburbs. Conversations didn't stop, not immediately, but they shifted. Eyes lingered a second too long. Smiles tightened at the edges. A whisper here, a glance there. It was the quiet language of exclusion, fluent and effortless. Near the center of the ballroom, Victoria Sinclair noticed her first. Victoria stood surrounded by a circle of social elites, her presence commanding in a deep emerald gown that caught the light with every calculated movement. Her posture was perfect, her smile precise, the kind that suggested warmth while measuring worth. She tilted her head slightly, watching Margaret the way one might observe an unexpected interruption in an otherwise flawless evening. "Interesting choice of guest list tonight," she murmured, just loud enough for her circle to hear. A soft ripple of amusement followed, delicate laughter wrapped in polished restraint. Margaret continued walking, unhurried, her gaze steady but unintrusive, as if she had long ago learned how to exist without demanding space from those who believed they owned it. She paused briefly near a table of champagne flutes, her fingers brushing the stem of one glass before withdrawing, not out of hesitation, but consideration. Across the room, Victoria's group began to close in, curiosity sharpened into something less generous. One woman leaned closer, her voice coated in honeyed condescension. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" Another added with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "This is a private event." The circle tightened, subtle but deliberate, creating a stage without announcing it. Margaret looked at them, really looked this time, her expression calm, almost reflective, as if she were studying something far more interesting than their words. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The music continued, glasses clinked in the distance, but here, right here, something quieter began to form. The kind of silence that doesn't arrive loudly, but settles in, unnoticed, until it refuses to leave. Victoria's smile sharpened just slightly, the kind that revealed more intent than warmth, as she took a slow step forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, each sound precise, controlled, deliberate, as if she were conducting the moment itself. "It is a beautiful venue, is it not?" she said, her tone smooth, almost welcoming, yet threaded with something colder beneath the surface. Although events like this tend to be curated. A few members of her circle exchanged glances, their expressions hovering between amusement and anticipation, as though they had seen this performance before and knew exactly how it would end. Margaret remained still, her posture relaxed, her hands resting gently at her sides, not defensive, not apologetic, simply present. The chandelier light reflected softly in her eyes, steady and unhurried, as if time moved differently for her than it did for everyone else in that room. "I imagine invitations can be confusing," another woman added, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention from nearby guests. Conversations nearby began to dim, not because anyone had been asked to listen, but because moments like this had a gravity of their own. People turned subtly, glasses paused midair, curiosity sharpening into focus. Victoria tilted her head again, studying Margaret more closely now, as though trying to solve a puzzle that did not quite fit her expectations. "Who exactly are you here with?" she asked, her words wrapped in politeness but edged with scrutiny. It was not a question meant to be answered. It was a test. Margaret's gaze moved briefly across the room, taking in the polished surfaces, the practiced laughter, the carefully constructed hierarchies that floated invisibly between people. For a moment, she said nothing, and in that silence, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that those closest to her felt it, a subtle resistance to the pressure being applied. "I am exactly where I need to be," Margaret replied at last, her voice calm, even, carrying just far enough to be heard without ever rising. The response was simple, but it landed differently than expected. A faint crease appeared between Victoria's brows, quickly smoothed away by another composed smile. "That is a lovely sentiment," Victoria said, though the warmth had faded. "However, this evening is reserved for individuals who have contributed significantly to the foundation. It would be unfortunate if there had been some kind of misunderstanding." The word misunderstanding lingered in the air, heavy with implication. A soft murmur rippled through the surrounding guests, the kind that signaled agreement without commitment, safety without involvement. Margaret nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the statement rather than resisting it, her expression unchanged, her composure unshaken. She glanced briefly toward the stage at the far end of the ballroom, where a podium stood beneath a focused beam of light, waiting. The program had not yet reached that point, but it would soon. Victoria followed her gaze, a flicker of irritation crossing her face, as though Margaret's lack of reaction disrupted the rhythm she had intended to control. "Perhaps we should have someone verify your credentials," Victoria continued, her voice tightening just enough to reveal the impatience beneath her polished exterior. "It would save everyone a great deal of discomfort." The circle around them tightened again, the unspoken boundary becoming more visible, more deliberate. And yet, Margaret did not move. She did not step back, did not apologize, did not explain. She simply stood there, quiet and grounded, as if the space belonged to her in a way no one else could quite understand. Across the room, a staff member glanced toward the stage manager, who checked his watch, then looked toward the podium. The schedule was moving forward. The moment was approaching. And still, Margaret Whitmore remained exactly where she was, as if she had been waiting all along. The air grew tighter, not with noise, but with expectation, as if the entire ballroom had begun to lean inward without realizing it, drawn toward a moment no one had planned but everyone now felt. Victoria's patience thinned beneath her composed exterior, her fingers curling slightly around the stem of her champagne glass as she exchanged a brief glance with one of the event coordinators standing nearby. A subtle nod was all it took. Within seconds, a tall man in a fitted black suit approached, his posture formal, his expression carefully neutral, though the intent was unmistakable. "Good evening, ma'am," he said to Margaret, his voice polite but firm, the practiced tone of someone accustomed to resolving situations quietly before they became visible. "I believe there may have been some confusion regarding guest access tonight." The words were gentle, but they carried the weight of removal, of correction, of restoring what others believed to be order. Around them, conversations had not fully stopped, but they had shifted into a softer register, voices lowered, attention sharpened. No one wanted to be obvious, yet no one looked away. Margaret turned her gaze toward the man, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, as if she had heard variations of this moment many times before and had long since stopped reacting to its surface. "There is no confusion," she replied, her voice even, measured, not defensive, not challenging, simply certain. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough for doubt to flicker beneath his professional composure before it was quickly masked again. Victoria stepped forward then, reclaiming control of the moment with a practiced ease, her smile returning, though it no longer reached her eyes. "I am sure we can resolve this gracefully," she said, addressing both Margaret and the staff member, her tone smooth but unmistakably directive. "We have a schedule to maintain and guests to accommodate." Her words were not loud, yet they carried far enough to settle over the nearby crowd like a soft command. Margaret's gaze shifted once more, not to Victoria this time, but toward the stage, where a technician adjusted the microphone, tapping it lightly as a faint echo carried across the room. The program was about to begin. A low chime sounded through the speakers, signaling the transition. Conversations began to taper off, clusters of guests turning their attention toward the front of the ballroom. The lighting subtly shifted, dimming around the edges while the stage grew brighter, pulling focus with quiet authority. The man in the black suit glanced toward the stage, then back at Margaret, uncertainty now more visible in the slight pause of his movements. Timing was no longer on his side. "Perhaps we can step aside and discuss this privately," he suggested, his tone softening, though the request still held expectation. Margaret did not move. She did not argue. She simply looked at him, then past him, toward the growing light at the podium, as if something far more important was about to unfold. "There will be time for that later," she said gently. The words were calm, but they carried a quiet finality that disrupted the rhythm of the moment. Victoria's expression tightened, just briefly, before she composed herself again, though the certainty she had carried earlier now seemed slightly less solid, as if a hairline crack had formed beneath its surface. Around them, chairs began to fill, guests drifting toward their seats, though many still lingered close enough to watch, unwilling to miss whatever this had become. The room was not loud, but it was no longer casual either. Something had shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that even those who did not understand it could feel it settling into place. And as the final lights focused on the stage, Margaret Whitmore remained exactly where she stood, untouched by the pressure around her, as if she had been waiting not to prove herself, but for the room to reveal itself. The final note of the chime faded into a soft hush as the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, his polished shoes catching the light as he adjusted the microphone and offered a practiced smile to the room. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and confident, carrying easily across the ballroom. "Thank you for joining us tonight in support of a cause that continues to shape lives, communities, and futures." Applause followed, warm but measured, the kind that acknowledged importance without surrendering attention. Guests settled into their seats, though a noticeable number remained standing just long enough to glance back toward the small cluster where Margaret still stood. The tension there had not dissolved. It had simply become quieter, more contained, like a question waiting to be answered. Victoria exhaled slowly, regaining her composure as she turned her focus toward the stage, though her eyes flickered once more toward Margaret, as if unwilling to fully release control of the situation. The man in the black suit stepped back, uncertain now, his earlier authority softened by timing he could no longer command. On stage, the host continued, outlining the evening's purpose, speaking of impact, generosity, and legacy, words that floated elegantly through the room, familiar and expected. "And tonight," he added, pausing slightly as he glanced down at his notes, "we have the privilege of hearing from someone whose vision made all of this possible." A subtle shift moved through the audience, curiosity sharpening again, though this time it was directed forward, toward the stage, toward anticipation rather than judgment. Victoria's posture straightened, a small, confident smile returning as she adjusted the delicate bracelet at her wrist. She leaned slightly toward one of her companions, her voice low but assured. "This should be impressive," she murmured, already preparing to receive, to evaluate, to approve. Near the edge of the crowd, Margaret took a single step forward. It was not dramatic. It was not announced. Yet something about it drew attention, a quiet disruption in the pattern of stillness. The host glanced up from his notes again, scanning the room as if locating a point he had expected to find. His expression shifted, just slightly, recognition settling into place. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, his voice now carrying a different tone, one that replaced performance with respect. "Whenever you are ready." The words landed softly, but their meaning rippled outward instantly. A few heads turned, then more. Conversations that had only just settled into silence tightened again, this time with confusion. Victoria blinked once, the smile on her lips faltering before she could stop it. "Whitmore," someone whispered behind her, the name passing from one guest to another like a thread being pulled through fabric. Margaret did not rush. She moved with the same steady pace she had carried since entering the room, her steps quiet against the marble floor as she walked toward the stage. No one stopped her now. No one spoke. The path opened without instruction, as if the room itself had begun to rearrange around her presence. The man in the black suit stepped aside completely, his earlier certainty replaced by something closer to realization. Victoria remained where she stood, her posture still composed, but her eyes fixed now, following Margaret with an intensity that no longer masked curiosity. On stage, the host stepped back, offering the space with a respectful nod. Margaret reached the podium and rested her hands lightly against its surface, her fingers steady, her expression calm. For a moment, she said nothing. The microphone carried only the faint sound of her breath, the subtle shift of fabric, the quiet presence of someone who did not need to demand attention because she already had it. And then, as the last whisper faded and the room settled into complete stillness, Margaret Whitmore lifted her gaze, and the silence became absolute. Margaret let the silence breathe for just a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but intention, as if she understood that what she was about to say required the room to truly listen rather than simply hear. Her eyes moved gently across the audience, not scanning for approval, not searching for recognition, but observing with a quiet familiarity, as though she had seen rooms like this before, filled with the same polished confidence and carefully constructed identities. "Thank you for being here tonight," she began, her voice calm and steady, carrying effortlessly through the microphone without force. It was not loud, but it reached every corner of the ballroom, settling into the space with a clarity that demanded attention. It is always encouraging to see people come together in the name of generosity. A few guests shifted slightly in their seats, the tone of her voice different from what they had expected, lacking the rehearsed enthusiasm they were accustomed to hearing at events like this. Margaret paused briefly, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the podium, her posture relaxed, grounded. "But generosity," she continued, "is not measured by the size of a donation or the elegance of an evening." The words were simple, yet they landed with weight, creating a subtle ripple that moved through the audience. Victoria's expression remained composed, but her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, as if trying to anticipate where this was going. "It is measured," Margaret said, her gaze steady now, "by how we treat people when there is nothing to gain." The room grew quieter, if that were even possible, the kind of silence that deepens rather than fades. A man near the front shifted in his chair, setting his glass down more carefully than before. Somewhere in the back, a soft cough was quickly stifled, as if even small sounds felt out of place. Margaret did not rush. She allowed each sentence to settle, each thought to find its place. "I have spent many years working with individuals who have far less than most of us in this room," she said, her voice still even, still composed. "And I have learned something very simple." She paused again, just long enough for the anticipation to build, for the room to lean in without realizing it. The way a person treats someone who can do nothing for them reveals everything about who they are. The words did not accuse. They did not raise in volume. And yet they carried more weight than any confrontation could have. Victoria's fingers tightened slightly around her glass, the faintest shift in her posture betraying the discomfort beginning to surface beneath her polished exterior. Around her, a few guests avoided eye contact, their earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, more reflective. Margaret's gaze moved again, briefly passing over Victoria's circle without lingering, not calling them out, not needing to. "Tonight is about impact," Margaret continued, her tone softening just slightly, though it lost none of its clarity. "About making a difference that extends beyond this room." She let that idea settle, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. But impact does not begin with wealth. It begins with character. The room held its breath. No one interrupted. No one moved. The chandeliers above continued to glow. The music had long since faded, and all that remained was the quiet weight of truth settling into a space that had not expected to be confronted by it. Margaret Whitmore stood there, not as someone seeking approval, not as someone demanding recognition, but as someone who understood exactly what this moment required. And in that stillness, the room began to change. Margaret allowed the silence to settle fully before continuing, her presence at the podium no longer questioned, no longer challenged, but quietly accepted in a way that no one in the room could have predicted just minutes earlier. Her eyes remained steady, her voice unchanged, yet something deeper had shifted, as if the room itself had begun to listen with a different kind of attention. "Many years ago," she said gently, "I attended an event very much like this one." A faint murmur of recognition moved through a few guests, not because they remembered the moment, but because the setting felt familiar, uncomfortably so. The same lights, the same conversations, the same assumptions about who belonged and who did not. Her words were not sharp, but they carried precision, each one placed carefully, deliberately. Victoria's posture remained upright, composed, but her expression had begun to lose its earlier certainty, her gaze fixed on Margaret now with an intensity that no longer masked control, but sought understanding. I remember standing at the edge of the room, Margaret continued, her voice soft but unwavering, and realizing that the most valuable thing I could contribute was not my name, or my resources, or my influence. She paused, letting the weight of that idea settle into the quiet. It was how I chose to see people. A man in the second row shifted slightly, his expression thoughtful, his earlier detachment replaced by something more reflective. A woman beside him lowered her eyes briefly, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass as if reconsidering something she could not quite name. "Because it is easy," Margaret said, her gaze moving gently across the audience once more, "to respect someone when they have already proven their worth to you." Her tone remained even, but the meaning deepened. It is much harder to extend that same respect before you know anything about them at all. The room was still, completely still. Even the smallest movements seemed to pause, as if the space itself had become aware of what was being revealed within it. Margaret's hands rested lightly on the podium, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded in a way that did not seek attention, but held it effortlessly. "This foundation was never built on wealth alone," she continued, her voice carrying a quiet strength now. "It was built on the belief that dignity should never have to be earned." A subtle ripple passed through the audience, not of sound, but of recognition, as if something long understood but rarely acknowledged had finally been spoken aloud. Victoria's grip on her glass loosened slightly, her shoulders lowering just enough to reveal the tension she could no longer fully conceal. Around her, the circle that had once felt so certain now seemed less defined, less unified, as if each person within it had retreated into their own thoughts. Margaret did not look at any one person for too long, and yet it felt as though she had seen everything that had taken place before she stepped onto that stage. "Every person who walks into a room," she said, her voice steady, her eyes clear, "carries a story you cannot see." She let the sentence rest, allowing its simplicity to do the work no accusation ever could. And how you respond to that unseen story defines more than you may realize. The chandeliers above continued to glow, casting the same light as before, but the room beneath them no longer felt the same. Something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. And Margaret Whitmore stood at the center of it, not as someone who had taken control, but as someone who had quietly revealed what had always been there. Margaret let her final words linger in the air, not rushing to fill the silence that followed, as if she understood that the most important moments were the ones where people were left alone with their own thoughts. The room remained still, but it was no longer the same stillness from before. This was different. This was heavier, more aware. Her gaze moved once more across the audience, softer now, yet somehow more direct, as though she was no longer speaking to a crowd, but to each individual person within it. "This foundation," she continued, her voice steady but carrying a deeper warmth, "was created to support people who are often overlooked. People who walk into rooms and are not seen, not heard, not valued." A subtle shift passed through the audience, the kind that could not be hidden behind polite expressions. A man in the front row leaned forward slightly, his earlier composure replaced by quiet attention. A woman near the aisle pressed her lips together, her eyes lowering for a brief moment. "And yet," Margaret said, her tone remaining calm, "those are often the very people who carry the greatest strength." She paused, allowing the idea to settle, her presence anchoring the room in a way that no announcement or introduction ever could. Because they have learned how to stand without recognition, how to contribute without applause, how to remain kind, even when they are not treated with it. Victoria's breath caught almost imperceptibly, her posture still controlled, but her eyes no longer held the same certainty. Around her, the subtle glances between guests had changed. There was no longer amusement, no longer quiet judgment, only a shared awareness that something real had been exposed, something that could not be dismissed or redirected. Margaret's hands rested gently on the podium, her expression composed, her voice unwavering. "Tonight," she said, "we celebrate generosity. But generosity is not only about giving resources. It is about giving respect, freely, without conditions, without expectation." The words landed with a quiet force, not demanding agreement, but making it difficult to ignore. The chandeliers above continued to glow, casting the same golden light across the room. But beneath that light, faces had changed. Expressions had softened. Some had tightened. Some had turned inward. The performance of the evening had begun to dissolve, replaced by something far less comfortable, but far more honest. Margaret drew a slow breath, her eyes lifting slightly as she looked toward the back of the room, where she had first entered, where the moment had begun. Behind her, lowered his gaze respectfully, as if acknowledging something that no longer required explanation. A few members of the organizing committee exchanged glances, their earlier confidence replaced by quiet recognition. "That commitment," Margaret said, her tone steady, "was made by someone who believed that influence should never be used to elevate oneself, but to elevate others." The words landed with weight, not dramatic, but undeniable. Victoria's breath slowed, her posture still composed, yet her expression had shifted completely now, no longer guarded, but searching, as if the pieces were beginning to align in a way she had not expected. Margaret's hands remained gently placed on the podium, her presence calm, grounded, unshaken. "For many years," she continued, "that individual chose to remain unseen, not because they lacked recognition, but because they understood that true impact does not require an audience." A faint ripple moved through the room, not of sound, but of realization. The man in the black suit near the side of the stage straightened slightly, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a quiet respect. A woman near the front lowered her gaze, her expression softening as understanding began to take shape. Margaret drew a slow breath, her eyes lifting slightly, meeting the room fully now, without hesitation, without distance. "Tonight," she said, "I stand here not as a guest, but as that individual." The words did not rise. They did not demand attention, and yet they changed everything. The room did not gasp. It did not erupt. It simply stopped. Completely. Utterly. The kind of silence that follows a truth too clear to deny. Victoria's hand stilled entirely, the glass she held forgotten, her eyes fixed on Margaret with a stillness that revealed more than any reaction could. Around her, the circle that once defined status and certainty had dissolved into quiet introspection. No one spoke. No one moved. The chandeliers above continued to glow as they always had, but beneath them, the room no longer belonged to the same assumptions. Margaret's gaze softened slightly, not triumphant, not accusatory, but knowing. "Every scholarship awarded," she said gently. "Every life changed, every opportunity created, began with a belief that dignity should never depend on perception." Her voice remained calm, but its meaning settled deeply, reaching into the space that had once been filled with quiet judgment. "And that belief," she added, her eyes steady, "remains unchanged." The silence did not break. It deepened. And in that stillness, every glance, every word, every moment from earlier in the evening returned with unmistakable clarity, leaving behind a single truth that no one in that room could escape. No one moved for what felt like several seconds, as if the room itself needed time to adjust to a reality it had not prepared for. And in that suspended stillness, every earlier word, every glance, every quiet judgment returned with a clarity that could not be softened or ignored. Margaret did not rush to fill the silence, nor did she attempt to shift the weight of the moment. She simply stood there, her hands resting lightly against the podium, her presence unchanged, as though nothing about her had altered, only the way she was seen. The host behind her remained still, his usual polished demeanor replaced by a quiet respect that required no performance. In the audience, expressions had transformed completely. Where there had once been amusement, there was now reflection. Where there had been certainty, there was now hesitation. And in the center of it all, Victoria Sinclair stood motionless, her earlier confidence dissolved into something far more human, something far less controlled. Her eyes remained fixed on Margaret, not with defiance, not with dismissal, but with the unmistakable recognition of a truth she could not step away from. The glass in her hand lowered slowly, her fingers loosening as if the weight of it no longer mattered. Around her, no one spoke. No one offered a distraction. There was no place to redirect the moment, no conversation to hide behind. Margaret drew a quiet breath, her gaze softening slightly as she looked across the room one final time. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice calm, without emphasis, without expectation, yet it carried further than anything else she had spoken that night. It was not a closing meant to impress. It was a closing that allowed the room to sit with what it had been given. She stepped back from the podium then, her movements unhurried, her posture unchanged, as if she had merely completed a conversation rather than transformed an entire room. The host instinctively stepped forward, though for a brief moment. Even he seemed unsure whether anything more needed to be said. Applause began slowly, uncertain at first, then building, not into a loud ovation, but into something steadier, more genuine, as if each person was choosing it rather than following it. Margaret acknowledged it with a small, polite nod, nothing more, before turning and stepping away from the stage. The path that had once been blocked now opened effortlessly, not because she demanded it, but because no one would think to stand in her way again. As she moved through the ballroom, people shifted, some stepping aside, others lowering their gaze, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. Victoria remained where she was until Margaret passed within a few feet of her. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Victoria opened her mouth slightly, as if searching for words, for something that could restore balance, but nothing came. Margaret did not pause. She did not wait. She simply inclined her head, a small gesture of acknowledgement that carried no judgment, no triumph, only quiet clarity, and then she continued walking. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened once more, the night air beyond calm and unassuming, untouched by what had just unfolded inside. Margaret Whitmore stepped through without looking back, her figure disappearing into the quiet beyond, leaving behind a room that no longer felt the same. And in that lingering silence, long after the applause had faded and conversation slowly returned, one truth remained, settling deeper than any decoration or display of wealth ever could. Respect had never belonged to those who demanded it. It had always belonged to those who carried it quietly,